Throughout gaming history, many business partnerships have been formed. However, sadly, not all of them have resulted in the release of successful consoles. Of course, the most famous gaming deal to fall apart occurred between Nintendo and Sony, which would result in the Nintendo PlayStation being cancelled and Sony entering the home console market alone. While this well-known example changed the gaming world forever, plenty of lesser-known team-ups amounted to nothing. If you watched my channel for a while, you will know that Atari was set to release the NES and then later the Sega Genesis. In fact, speaking of Sega, I made a video here looking at the Sega PlayStation deal that was being brokered after Sony's fallout with Nintendo. Since we have already looked at all of these, let's look at an even lesser known piece of obscure gaming history. That time, or should I say times, that discussions were in place to create a Sega 3DO console. So without further ado, I am Lady Decade and this is the story of the lost Sega 3DO. To get to grips with this bizarre chapter in gaming history, we should first turn our attention to the 3DO company by looking at its leader. The 3DO company was founded by Tripp Hawkins, the same dashing gentleman who had established EA earlier. Speaking of EA, during Tripp's tenure with Electronic Arts, to avoid paying licensing fees, Tripp would hire a team to reverse engineer the Genesis so that cartridges could be produced for it without paying Sega for the privilege. Clever Hawkins would eventually reveal the results of this cunning undertaking to Sega, cockily stating, "You can sue, but we did the tech fair and square and have great lawyers, so make us an official licensee and give us a reduced rate." In fear that Hawkins would sell his research to third parties, Sega would reluctantly agree to a partnership with the young tycoon. But this is just the beginning of the story documenting sexy Tripp Hawkins' relationship with Sega. Though remaining chair of the board at EA for a while, Tripp would form a 3DO to explore producing a video game console himself. This would eventually result in the release of the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, a home video game console that was released in 1993. The 3DO console was notable for its advanced hardware and software at the time. The console was marketed as a high-end multimedia device that could play games, music CDs and video discs. It used a custom 32-bit CPU and was one of the first consoles to feature a built-in CD-ROM drive. Initially released in North America in October of that year for $699, this made the 3DO the most powerful and most expensive game console in the world. Notable for some of its great titles like Road Rash, Alone in the Dark, Return Fire and Samurai Shodown, which were all critically acclaimed, the 3DO had somewhat of a following. Despite some initial success, the 3DO struggled to compete against more affordable consoles. As a result, the 3DO failed to gain a significant market share. Still, it is remembered today for its innovative hardware design, some of its exclusive games, and the fact that the manufacturing of units was a joint venture and handled by Panasonic, Sanyo, and later Gold Star, meaning that one 3DO may carry different branding and shell design to the next. Of course, these were not the only companies that 3DO were intending to have a relationship with, as at one point Sega were on their radar too. As for Sega, throughout the early 90s, Sega of America had the legendary Tom Kalinske at the helm, who is often credited with many of the successes Sega enjoyed over Nintendo at the time. Kalinske constantly looked for new and innovative ways to get one up over the competition. In an interview on a retro gaming podcast in the past, Kalinske speaks about Sega's partnership with 3DO, stating, "We had meetings in Japan with Tripp Hawkins, consisting of very serious discussions in Tokyo. We talked about the possibility of should Sega do a 3DO type of effort and combine with Tripp on that machine. History shows no Sega 3DO deal occurred here, as no Sega branded 3DO interactive media player exists. Regarding this, Tom Kalinske adds that he is glad such a product never came to fruition, stating, I was not for that, mainly because of the complexity of the product and the cost. The cost was very high. Any chance of the 3DO interactive media player had of succeeding was immediately nipped in the bud when the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation hit the market. But after the less than stellar sales the Sega Saturn would experience in its own right, talks with the 3DO company would open up again later. Intriguing. While researching this episode, I stumbled across an old article released by a journalist on the 23rd of August 1995, reporting that Sega may be buying the 3DO company. The report reads, "Dramatically alter the landscape of the electronic game industry," sources said. No price has been mentioned, but Tripp Hawkins, the founder and chief executive of 3DO, reportedly has been offered a deal for all or a portion of the company. The company's current market value is $250 million. Also, Sega is talking to Charles "Skip" Paul, executive vice president of MCA Incorporated, a 3DO board member, to head Sega USA, the company's coin-operated game and theme park division. MCA has a 300,000 share investment in 3DO. The scenario drawn by several industry sources points to Sega's disappointment with the performance and sales of its newest machine, the Saturn. The company is also wary of competitor Nintendo Company Limited's Ultra 64. Its newest machine, expected out sometime next year, uses more sophisticated technology and could hurt Sega Saturn sales. The report also notes that Sega was not at the time able to spend as much money on marketing the Sega Saturn as Sony could with their PlayStation, so they were looking for new business opportunities. They would also add that they foresaw Sega looking to exit the home console hardware market in the not too distant future due to its being unprofitable. This forecast would come true half a decade later after the underperformance of the Dreamcast. So, a good prediction indeed. Back then though, according to the article's sources at least, Sega had tentative plans to consider aligning with Panasonic, who owned 13.5% of the 3DO company at the time, with them being a 3DO console manufacturer. The rest of the article reads, "Sega longs to do what it does well, make great video games. 3DO officials would not comment specifically about Sega's intentions, but denied any knowledge of pending deals. But fueling speculation, Hawkins and Sega's president Hayao Nakayama met 2 weeks ago in Japan, apparently to discuss the deal. 3DO would not confirm Hawkins' travel schedule. Charles Paul of Panasonic was reportedly playing golf with Nakayama 4 days ago, another source said. All these meetings raised the question, what happens to Tripp Hawkins when Panasonic, his major manufacturer and key investor, teams up with Sega, run by Paul, and Tom Kalinske, the current head of Sega of America in Redwood City. Stephen Eskenazi, an analyst at Alex Brown & Sons Incorporated, would add, in my opinion, whatever is being discussed, it would be highly unlikely for Tripp not to be a part of it, or to be moved out. The report concludes that these complicated dealings were typical for the cutthroat multi-billion-dollar 90s gaming industry. They added, at that current point in history, to survive in gaming, it was about having big enough money and big enough ego to outlast competitors. Keeping these factors in mind, these were undoubtedly some of Hawkins' strengths. They would write, "He has battled the video game industry since he started 3DO in 1991. He may now decide to carve up his company, sell a portion or license its latest technology, dubbed the M2, to Sega of America, Philips Electronics in Europe and Matsushita in Japan." So, bearing this in mind, let's take a look at what happened next. Let's first look at the 3DO M2, a planned successor to the 3DO interactive multiplayer console produced by Panasonic in the early 1990s. It was set to feature hardware improvements such as a 64-bit CPU and support for DVD-ROMs. Originally, the M2 was co-designed by Dave Needle and R.J. Mickle, the same gentleman who had designed the hardware for both the 3DO interactive media player and the Atari Lynx, before that. At first, the M2 was intended to be an add-on chip for the original 3DO models, but eventually it would be scheduled to become its own console. Plans were also in place to license the console to multiple parties. However, later, as the article we looked at predicted, would see Tripp Hawkins 3DO sell the exclusive right of the M2 to just one company, in this case being Panasonic rather than Sega. The successor to the 3DO interactive multiplayer was designed to compete with the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. The M2 would have been a more powerful system with enhanced graphics and sound capabilities. Despite this, the project was cancelled, although some prototypes survived. Before the M2 project's demise, Sega and Panasonic began discussing partnership to work on the M2 together. However, talks would break down in the second quarter of 1996, with Next Generation reporting on this in depth. They reported the clandestine talks concerning licensing M2 technology ended, highlighting that whispers of Sega's interest in the tech had been circulating before the Panasonic buyout. After this, new rumours began spiralling of Panasonic licensing the M2 tech to Sega. The article documents that Sega took a consignment of M2 prototypes for early analysis that year. Still, talks later collapsed because Sega wanted it to be the sole M2 brand, which contravened Matsushita's Panasonic vision for the technology. Building on this, they add, Sega technicians were reportedly not impressed with the M2. They were not sufficiently awestruck to warrant its immediate implementation into their plans. Fortunately for us at home, we would get Tripp Hawkins' take on all of this within issue 22 of Next Generation, whereby a journalist would ask him multiple questions regarding his dealings with Sega. They would ask if he felt the M2 would sell better as a game machine if it had a big Sega badge slapped on. Tripp cockily replied, "Well, that's an interesting question for Sega because they're literally hemorrhaging money at the moment, and because of all their problems, they've either shut down or restructured almost all of their international operations. And I think you've now got to question whether or not Sega still has the ability to be a major supplier of a new format." Personally, I find it shocking that Sony outperformed Sega as much as they did. In the US, those two companies have had virtually the same price point, the same product features, and similarly attractive software libraries. Sega even had a 6-month head start, yet Sony outsold them by a ratio of 5-1. Shots fired. Tripp adds, "I think that what happened was a lot of consumers got fed up with Sega pulling the rug from under their hardware so many times, and everyone ended up saying, 'Screw you, Sega.' It's going to be tough for Sega from here on in, particularly as they're not proving to be very good at designing their own hardware." The journo then asks Tripp why he thinks Sega doesn't simply dip out of making consoles and license their brand to Matsushita for M2. Tripp replies that, "It makes sense to me, that's why we tried to do it. For most of last year, Sega was interested in doing that, but at the end of the day, I think Sega's corporate ego is still too big to allow them to partner with anyone. But I don't think that means they won't do it in the future. Sega is a very autocratic company. It's really driven by Nakayama and whatever he wants to do. But I think there's a pretty good chance that in the next couple of years he will throw in the towel and say screw it, let's just be a really great software company." Which is, as we know, exactly what Sega did down the line. Tripp comments, "In many ways, the Matsushita and Sega relationship would have made a lot of sense, because you would have had Sega's marketing acumen and software plus the manufacturing power and technology of Matsushita backing it up. Regarding the negotiations to make this a reality, Tripp raises a deal that was virtually done before it fell apart at the last minute. Tripp blames egos on both sides, ruining the scenario. One interesting twist in this is Tripp suggests that Sega may have lost interest in the M2 because it could play DVDs. Ironically, the exact format which many people accredit to helping the PS2 destroy the Dreamcast. In this 1996 article, Tripp reports that Sega was anti-DVD because the research of the era suggested that consumers who buy a DVD player with gaming capabilities will focus on the DVD brand, not the gaming brand, adding, "I've heard many consumers say they wouldn't dare buy a Sega or Nintendo branded DVD player. They think that the movie quality would be lousy. And while that may not be the case, it's certainly the perception. And if DVD does turn out to be the Trojan horse that drives the game business forward, it benefits Sony and Matsushita enormously, and it becomes a question of how Sega and Nintendo fit in." Well, as we now know, the DVD era very much did become a reality, and with regards to how well Nintendo and Sega fit into this one, we can confidently say terribly. The PS2 with its DVDs dominated the market, and the newcomer, the Xbox, came second place in that console war. The Nintendo GameCube would sell embarrassingly poorly for a Nintendo console, and Sega would exit the hardware market altogether. It is interesting to finally learn from all of this why perhaps the Dreamcast was not DVD capable. It is even more interesting that Tripp hypothesises that Sega scoffed at the M2 because it was DVD ready. I learned far more than I expected when researching this story, with the Sega 3DO rabbit hole going deeper than I possibly imagined. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, watch my previous video on the Atari Genesis. Thanks, bye.